Good afternoon. My name is Patrick Allen, and I'm an interviewer for the Veterans History Project for the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And it is conducted in Southwest Ohio through the Cincinnati-Hamilton County Public Library under the guidance of Brian Powers. And we're lucky today to have our cameraman, Tom Lee, also from Cincinnati, Ohio. And we're honored to interview today one of my heroes from World War II, Walter Boston Stitt, S-T-I-T-T, and today is September the 17th, and we're at his home at 2111 Montego Drive in Springfield, Ohio. Walter, thank you very much for doing this interview.
I'm pleased to be here.
For our record, tell us your full name and your birth date.
Well, my full name is Walter Boston Stitt, Jr. I don't use the junior much anymore. My birthday was July the 24th, 1924. I was born in Marietta, Ohio.
So you are just reached your 100th birthday, is that correct?
I did, yes. And my daughter arranged quite a few celebrations.
And you were born in Marietta? How long did you live in Marietta?
I think I lived in Marietta for a couple of years, and then my father changed jobs and we moved to Columbus, Ohio.
All right. Well, let's talk about your mom and dad. What was your dad's name?
He was Walter Boston Stitt Sr., and my mother's name was Ada Ruth, and her maiden name was Krickenberger.
C-R-I-C-K-E.
N-B-E-R-G-E-R, yeah.
All right. Where was your dad from? What was his home?
My dad was born and raised in Bridgeport, Ohio.
And how about your mom?
And my mother was born in Virginia, in Luray, Virginia. But her father was a pastor, and so she ended up in Bridgeport, Ohio. And she and my father went to high school together and ultimately got married.
Is that a coaster?
Do you have any recollection of when they got married?
No.
Where did they marry? In Bridgeport?
They married in Bridgeport, yeah.
All right. And were you the first child?
Yes.
Any other siblings?
Yes, I have a brother who was 2 years younger, and a sister who is since deceased, but was 5 years younger.
What's your brother's name?
My brother's name is Richard, and his middle name is Payne, P-A-Y-N-E, which is a family name from Virginia.
And he's 2 years younger than you?
He is 2 years younger than me.
Is he still with us?
Yes, he will be 98 in November.
Great. Where does he live?
He lives in Cincinnati. He's retired, of course. And
was Richard married?
yes, his wife died about a year ago.
What was her name?
Oh, you asked me too soon. Let me think about that. But he had 3 sons. The oldest one was Tom, who still is living in California. He has a son, Paul, who lives in Cincinnati, and a son, David, who lives in Massachusetts. And my sister-in-law's name was Maisie.
Was what?
Maisie.
Maisie?
Yes, M-A-Z-I-E, Maisie.
What was your sister's name?
Sarah Ruth was her real name, but everybody called her Sally.
And when did she pass away?
She passed away in December last year at 90.
Was Sarah married?
She was married and divorced.
Okay.
Had 2 sons. One lives in Missouri and Houston. Well, no, not Houston, in Springfield, Missouri. And another son who lives in Arizona.
Now, you said you lived in Marietta for a couple of years. What did your dad do while he was down in Marietta?
Well, when he got out of college, he went to work for what was called the Marietta Chair Factory. Was later bought out by Remington Rand. And somewhere along the way, he changed jobs and went to work for a company in Columbus, Ohio. And so we moved there to Columbus.
What part of Columbus did you live in?
You know, I don't remember. I don't know. And I don't think I ever heard the address.
Was it the north end, the east end, south?
No, I think it was pretty much close to downtown Columbus in those days.
Okay.
And then my father lost his job, and my mother went to Grafton, West Virginia to be with her family, her father and mother, and there's where she gave birth to my 2-year-old younger brother.
Well, what was your dad doing before he lost his job?
He was a salesman, outdoor salesman, selling building supplies.
And when he lost that job, then what kind of a job did he get?
Well, he went to Grafton, followed my mother to Grafton, and worked for my uncle, who had a real estate and insurance business. And
wasn't Grafton, West Virginia?
Yes.
Wasn't that kind of a railroad center?
It was, yeah. I suppose it still is. It was one of the main stops on the B&O.
Mm-hmm.
They had repair shops there. Every place in town had a foot of coal ash from those engines, belching smoke.
Did you attend elementary or grade school there in Grafton?
No. My father left there and got a job in Detroit working for Wheeling Steel. And I went to kindergarten and the first grade in Detroit. And then he changed jobs, and we went to Nitro, West Virginia.
Well, that's right on the Kanawha River.
Yeah, it's down there.
There was a lot of chemical plants down there. Did he work in the chemical industry?
No, he taught school. It's hard to imagine, but he taught mathematics in girls' gym. And so he did that for 2 years, and then got a job with the Dunbar Glass Company. Dunbar not being too far away from Nitro.
Right.
And then we moved from there to Cleveland, and I started the 4th grade in Cleveland. And in December of that year, my grandmother died, my father's mother, and his father, my grandfather, was not able to live by himself. And he said if we'd come and live with him, now this is all during the Depression, that if we'd come and live with him, that he could take care of the food and things like that, and my mother could cook for him. And so we moved back to Bridgeport, or moved to Bridgeport, because I had never lived there before. And that was then there until 1938. And my father got a job with Prudential Insurance Company as an agent in Wheeling, West Virginia. And the company said, well, they didn't want him in Ohio and working in West Virginia, so we moved to Wheeling. And I started the 8th grade in Wheeling.
Public school or Catholic school?
Public school, yeah.
All right. So when did you get out of the 8th grade? How old were you?
14. I went to a high school and graduated from that high school, which is called Triadelphia District High School.
Triadelphia?
Triadelphia.
Where was that?
It was on old Route 40, well, still Route 40, the National Highway.
Was that in West Virginia?
Yeah, right there in Wheeling, yep.
And you graduate from Triadelphia?
Yep.
Did you work at all while you were in high school?
I did. I got a job as soon as I got my driver's license. I got a job with Bob's Potato Chips, and every Thursday I would go down, and I was in charge of putting the potatoes in the peeler, or in the peeler, and then taking them out and put them in the slicer. And then Bob, in the meantime, would put the fat, which was really lard, into a big tub, and he would come over and throw some of those chips in there. And then when the chips were done, he threw them up on a drain, and then by that time I was done with my job of the 2 kinds of potatoes, so I went over and started sacking them up. Had to get an ounce in each package, and I would do that, and then when he finished doing all the potatoes, he'd come over and we would fold them and staple them and make sure that had to weigh them to make sure it was 1 ounce of potato chips in each sack. Then we'd put them in the containers. And then on Saturday, I would go around to all the places where we had racks, mostly beer joints and places like that. That was my first job. And
well, with high school classes and working at Bob's, did you have any time to be involved in any extracurricular school activity?
I only went to deliver the potato chips on Saturday, and I worked for him on Thursday evenings. And I've laughed about that. I swore I'd never eat another potato chip every Thursday, because there they were, and you kept nibbling on them. But then I was offered a summer job as in the meantime, Bob, Muir, M-U-I-R, who owned the potato chip company, had finished studying and became a draftsman and got a job in Dundalk, Maryland. And he left, and his father took over the business, and I had an offer to go to work in the summer, I was an aide on a truck with Royal Crown, so I left the potato chip business. And worked all summer with Royal Crown.
Out on the routes?
Yes.
You went along with it with the driver?
Yes.
Okay.
And then when I graduated from high school, I was offered a job as a driver, because by then the war was on and they were having trouble finding older men or men to do the routes. So I was offered that job, and that's what I was doing when I went in the service.
Well, let me ask you a minute. You remember where you were when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor?
Yes.
Tell me where you were and how you learned of that.
My best friend, Bill McGann, and I had gone to the movies. Bill's father was our village doctor there, and he had been World War I veteran in the medics. And when we came home, his father had this long look on his face, and he said, "Bad news." And we said, "What's that?" And he said, "The Japanese just attacked Pearl Harbor. So it just means we're going to be at war again."
And you were what, 17 or 18 at that time?
I was, let's see, I was 18, yeah.
And that was December of 41. Were you still in high school?
Yeah, okay, I'm getting this, let me get that straight. Yeah, you're right, because I didn't finish high school till 42, and then went to work for Royal Crown. And then in January of 1943, none of the fellows that I went to high school with, among my close friends, none of them had been called up yet in a draft, and I was just sure that they were going to go in the next bunch. And so I went down and volunteered to go with the next bunch. My father pitched a fit when I came home and told him I'd done that. My father was a World War I veteran, although he never got overseas. And so he told me when I got in the service, "Don't tell him you're a truck driver. tell them you're a student. Said maybe they'll send you to school. And so as it turned out, I went in March with the next group, and none of my friends went with that group. They all went later.
Well, where did you go to sign up?
I went down to the draft board to sign up.
In what town?
In Wheeling. And then when I was in March of, I think it was 17th of March in '43,
Yep.
I went to Camp Polk, Louisiana. And the next day when I went to be interviewed, the officer looked at the thing. He said, "Oh," he said, "I see you're a truck driver."
You didn't have to volunteer.
And I said, "I don't want anything with a steering wheel." And I've laughed ever since. I said he probably went home and told his wife and just stood there and laughed, because he sent me to a tank unit that didn't have steering wheels. They had levers. But I went to...
Well, how long were you at Camp Polk?
I was at Camp Polk 14 months.
What did you do while you were there? What kind of training did you have?
A lot of my training, in addition to all the tank training, a lot of my training was the same thing that the infantry would go through. I had to climb out of a muddy ditch and crawl on my stomach while they shot machine guns over my head, that sort of thing. How to do hand-to-hand combat, the things that were the most lethal for you to fight the enemy, that sort of thing. So we did all that like an infantryman, but we also did all the things in the tank. And I drove a tank one time, and of course, having experience driving trucks, I didn't have any trouble at all with that old beat-up tank, and I got it going at a high speed, and I really enjoyed that. But then later on, I made 100 gunnery test, and that sealed my fate. From then on, I was listed as a tank gunner. And
what kind of a tank were you trained in?
We had the first tank was a Chrysler Multibank, had 5 Chrysler engines, and when you started the thing, you had, if all the engines came on, you had 5 green lights, and then you'd be driving along, all of a sudden you'd have 4 green and 1 red, and then you could get down to 3 greens and 2 reds. And if you got 3 reds, it was all over, because there wasn't enough power to move the tank. But all the tanks worked the same as far as gear shifts and all of that. It was just that they changed engines. And while I was at Camp Polk, right before I left, they came out with what had to be one of the very first of the tanks with a Ford engine, and it would really get up and go. I mean, the tanks that we had, 20 miles an hour was probably the top speed.
Well, how much time did you spend in gunner training?
I'm sorry?
How much time did you spend in gunner training?
Not an awful lot. Mostly was, figuring out ranges and distances and that sort of thing. I fired somewhere around 8 rounds altogether at different kinds of targets.
How were the accommodations down there at Camp Polk, as far as living accommodations and food?
Oh, that was all. I liked all that. I mean, the barracks were all new, and the food you couldn't complain about. I was a tea drinker, but they never had tea, so I had to start drinking coffee, which I didn't like.
Were you a smoker?
Then I was a smoker, yes.
Had you smoked in high school or anything?
Oh yeah, I started in high school. I think I started smoking when I was about 15.
Did you have a particular brand that you liked?
Lucky Strikes, oh yes.
LSMFT? Lucky Strike means fine tobacco?
Yeah. And when I got on a train to go to leave Wheeling and go to Fort Hays in Columbus to be inducted, my father gave me a carton of Lucky Strikes.
So what'd your mom think about you going into the military? Your mom, what'd she think about it?
Oh, she didn't say much. You know, well, I don't remember that she said much at all, you know.
How about your younger brother?
Being a mother, she probably said, be sure and write home, because I did. But
how about your younger brother? Did he follow you into the service?
my younger brother, the first time he went, he was called up in the draft, and he went down, and he flunked because he was 13 pounds underweight. So he had a good job working for Wheeling Steel, had money, had a car, had a friend that drove a truck for a coal company and had some extra green stamps, so he had some gasoline for his car. And then, but he went down the second time. He really wanted in the service, and he went to the same place, and the same sergeant was there to weigh him. And my brother said, oh, he said, I sure hope I gained that 13 pounds. Said, I've been doing everything. He said, I've been eating bananas and everything. And he said, this sergeant looked at him, got a big smile on his face, didn't even weigh him, said, well, what do you know? He said, you gained 13 pounds. And my brother went in, but by the time he got down where they sent him to Wichita Falls, Texas, the war was almost over, and was over by the time he went through basic training. So he stayed in for yet about another year after the war was over.
Well, he was a lot luckier than you were. So,
oh yeah.
After your training there at Camp Polk, then where did you go?
We left in late May. All the privates and PFCs and second lieutenants were all shipped out, and we all went to New York. First we went to Fort George, Maryland, and then on the 30th of May, we boarded the Queen Elizabeth and headed for England. And,
where did you land there in England?
We landed on D-Day of all days. Well, we didn't land, we pulled up at the Firth of Clyde in Scotland.
Okay.
And then from there, I went by train down to Wells in Somerset County. And I was there in Wells for about 3 weeks.
What'd you do there during that 3 weeks?
Almost every morning we took a walk. And of course then, you know how the Army is, they gave you details to go get coal for the coal stoves or whatever else needed to be done. They didn't let you just sit around a lot. And after we'd been there, about 2 weeks, they finally gave us a lecture on how to behave ourselves and let us out to go into town and get a beer.
Well, let me go back to your trip over.
Sure.
How long did it take the Queen Mary to get you from New York over to the Firth of Clyde?
It took about 6 days, yeah, 5 or 6 days. About 6 days.
Did you have any U-boat encounters?
No, the Queen Elizabeth would zigzag. About every 15 minutes they'd change directions. And one of the days going over, we ran into a big fog bank, and I thought, oh, this is wonderful, because subways or submarines can't see you with a fog bank. So, but we went alone. There wasn't anybody with us, and just they put full speed because they outran any kind of a submarine.
You didn't have any kind of a convoy with you?
No, we just went alone.
How were the accommodations? How many guys were on the Queen Mary
Well,
then?
they said there was like 15,000. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. And it was divided into 3 sections, red, white, and blue, and you had to stay in your section. And I was on D deck, which was right on the water line. And I thought, boy, if this thing ever gets hit with a torpedo and I'm right on the water line, I don't want to be there. So I spent as much time as I could up on the upper decks. So if anything happened, I could get out. And of course, then they did have a lot of lifeboats and stuff like that, and we had to go through an instruction on how to get to those lifeboats. But there was no incidents at all.
What'd you do to occupy yourself
Played
few
cards
days?
mostly, yeah.
How was the food?
Food wasn't bad, except the British only fed twice a day, and they forgot about cutting the rind off the bacon, so you had that strip on there that you could hardly chew. It was like chewing your shoe. But otherwise, the food wasn't bad, and I never got seasick. There were a number of them that couldn't make it because the ship kept, in addition to going straight ahead, came up and down.
Uh-huh.
But I didn't have any trouble at all with the trip over.
How was the surface of the ocean? Was it pretty smooth, or?
Yeah, we never had any kind of problem that way at all. We get one. They took what they call it, the upper route, where you go up towards Iceland. They got waves up there, but that ship was a pretty good sized ship, and it once in a while would take a wave over the bow, but not very often.
Okay. So you told me you were down at Wells for about 3 weeks, and then
Yeah.
what was your assignment?
We just took hikes and did routines there. For 2 weeks, we just indoors, or in the camp, was surrounded by a rock wall, stone wall, and the last day we were there, somebody said, "You know, Walter, if you could go over there," and told me where it was, said you could go over that stone wall and drop down about 2 feet and you're out of this area, so you can go down and get a beer. Apparently they'd been doing that, so I said, well, that sounds good. So I got a friend of mine and off we went. Over the wall, no trouble at all, downtown, had a couple of beers, came back, climbed back over the wall, and about the time my feet hit the ground, there stood the officer of the day. He said, "Okay, soldier, let's see your pass." Well, of course, he knew I didn't have a pass. And he said, "What's your name and rank?" And he wrote all that down. And I thought, boy, I'm going to be on KP for the rest of my natural life. But the very next morning, we shipped out for France, and they weren't going to leave anybody behind. Well, we didn't go to France. We went down to Portsmouth to wait till they got a carload of us, and then put us on a ship. And then off we went to Omaha Beach.
So was that after D-Day?
Yes, this was about a month after D-Day.
When you got to
Because we spent
Omaha?
about a week at Portsmouth till they got all the personnel that they wanted there. And then they put us on a Liberty ship. And when we got over to Omaha Beach, the waves were too high to land us in those landing craft. So we just sat there and bobbed up and down on the anchor for about 2.5 days. Then finally they decided, well, we could do it. So we climbed over the side, down those cargo nets, and into the landing craft, those infantry landing craft. And once they got us all in there, they cut us loose. We went down in one of those swells, and all I could see was muddy water. And I thought, oh boy, here I am carrying a full field pack and pregnated clothes. And I thought, oh man, if this thing ever goes down, I'm in real trouble. But very shortly, the waves stopped being so high, and they took us in and got us off. And then we went and walked in about a mile or so, and they said, okay, dig your foxhole. And you know, PFCs and privates don't say why, they just grab a shovel and start digging. So I dug a foxhole, and I found out that first night why I needed a foxhole, because as soon as it got dark, here came this German bomber, and right away they turned on all the spotlights and started firing the anti-aircraft guns and told him right where we were. So he just dropped all those bombs and turned around and went back to Germany, or back where he came from, and killed, I understand, some people with those indiscriminate bombs. But from then on, why, I dug a foxhole very happily and quite deep.
So were you actually on the beach when the German plane
No,
bombed you?
we were in, I'm going to guess we were in a mile at least
Okay.
into a big field. And then there was nothing to do except eat and wait. And so I wandered around, and I wandered over into another field, and here was this black sergeant. And I walked up and started talking to him, and we had I don't remember what all we talked about, but after a while he said, "Do you think you can get 8 guys together, 9 guys together and play baseball?" He said, "We have bases and bats and balls and everything you need." He said, "We get a baseball game." And I said, "Sure." So he said, "Well, go back and get 8 more guys." And so I said, "Okay." And the last thing he said was, "But we're not going to play black against white, so we're mixing it." And I said, "Okay." So I went back, found some guys who wanted to play baseball. We went over and set up a field to play in. And I played second base. And this black guy was a shortstop. Of course, he was about my age, about 19. And he scooped up one of those balls, and I ran towards second base. He fired that thing at me, and I wasn't about, the gloves were old and thin, and I wasn't about to stick that glove out in front of that baseball. And I just let it go right on by. And he yelled at me and said, "Why didn't you catch that ball?" And I said, "Where'd you think I was, out in right field?" And so we laughed. I don't know how many innings we ever played or how the game came out, but it was fun for a while. You couldn't believe it because we were close enough that you could hear the artillery in the distance firing. So the front moved up, and then we would move up. And then when the front moved up, we would move up. And so I remember one time I dug my foxhole in one of those farm fields that were surrounded by the shrubs and trees and
hedgerows.
The hedgerows, yes. And this farmer walked out of his house, and you could tell he was counting his steps. And he turned, he was pushing a wheelbarrow, turned, counted some more steps and stopped, took his shovel and dug down and came out with about a 5-gallon jug of wine, put it on his wheelbarrow, and off he went. And he was so proud, he kept that from the Germans. But then I did that, and exactly how long I don't remember at all. And then one day, First Sergeant from E Company, the 33rd Armored Regiment of the 3rd Armored Division, called me. He called my name, and I came up, and he said, "I understand you're a gunner." And I said, "Yes, sir." Said, "How many rounds have you fired?" And I told him. He said, "Well," he said, "you're going to be in E Company." Okay. And so he came back later and with his Jeep and took me up and introduced me to 4 or 5 guys. And I thought they were going to be my crew. Didn't any of them end up as my crew, but they were all 3 sheets in the wind because they'd gotten a hold of some French Calvados. And I've laughed ever since. I said that French Calvados was like taking Sleepies, a couple of cocktails made out of that French wine. I said, boy, it just really was a dandy. So anyway, then we went from there. This was, I can place it because it was when the Falaise Gap was closed. It was when this all began to happen. And so then I rode in this half-track for about the next 10 days or so. And we just followed along with all these different trucks, supply trucks, kitchen trucks, tank recovery units, whatever, all they had in this big long thing from E Company. And we stopped one day in this little French village, and I was sitting there in a half-track, and all of a sudden this loud ding right on the side, and a sniper had shot at me and just missed by about 3 inches. and I screamed as loud as I could, "Sniper," and then I ducked down, and he shot once more and missed again, and then about that time we moved on. Later on, and again, you know, I don't know whether it was next day or 2 or 3 days later, I don't remember that closely since it was 80 years ago, but the half-track stopped on a railroad overpass, and I was sitting there on the side, and I looked down the railroad track, and the German ran out of one side, the woods, up across the tracks and down the other side. And there was a .30 caliber machine gun there, and I swung it around, armed it, and the next German came out. Boy, I cut down on him, and he went right on across and into the other woods. And I waited, and a third German came out, and I cut down on him, and same thing. Well, I finally realized about 50 years later that by the time those .30 caliber bullets got, because I was shooting right at them, that by the time those bullets got there, it was going just behind them because they were moving at a pretty good speed.
You weren't leading them at all.
Yeah, but I learned it too late. So anyway, then that evening, we all calmed down after that. That evening, somebody screamed "tanks," and everything got real quiet, and you could hear this clank, 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 clank coming down the road. And we were at a T intersection for this highway. So one of the people in this crew that I was with, Sergeant Vasquez, also from West Virginia, said, "Come on, Walter, we'll get the bazooka off the kitchen truck." So ran down, got the bazooka, and he and I ran up towards that tank and found a place we could hide where they couldn't see us. And he looked over at me, he said, "Now here's what I do." He said, "I'll fire that first shot." Said, "You load, I'll fire the second shot." Then he said, "And you'll now take off for Paris and claim we got lost in the dark." And so I doubt if he ever knew where Paris was any more than I did, but we laughed about it. But anyway, in the meantime, the tank had stopped because it gotten dark, and tanks don't like to travel at night for that very reason, because they can be shot with a bazooka, or the German shot with a Panzerfaust. So anyway, he and I went back, gave the bazooka back to the kitchen truck. In the meantime,
Well, was that a German tank?
we don't know. Since then, I think it was probably an American tank, because some of them had those steel tracks that clanked like that on the highway. But it could have been German, we didn't know. But anyway, whoever was leading our group, probably an officer of some rank, said, well, he wasn't going to stay there with this T intersection with his tank coming in the morning. So we moved and went on down the road where we were headed, and drove for a while, and he finally found a field, and we got off and got into this field and went and circled around like circling the wagons. And my half-track was over on the right-hand side facing the road. And we stayed there all night. And of course, you always had to have somebody on guard. And my guard duty that night was just at daylight. And as daylight was coming on, I heard tanks, and I screamed, and whatever direction Paris was, I'm sure they heard me scream "tanks." And so there wasn't a thing we could do. The only thing we had were a few rifles and that bazooka in the kitchen truck, and a 50 caliber machine gun on the half-track, and a 30 caliber machine gun. So we just stood there and waited, and pretty soon these tanks appeared, and by golly, they were American tanks, and he went right on by us and on down the highway, or on down they were in a field, on down the field. And so we all relaxed and had breakfast, and then somebody else let out a yell. There was a German column coming up the road, and they were coming from the direction where our tanks went. Here comes this German column. They were all wheeled vehicles. There weren't any kind of tanks or anything like that, just all wheeled vehicles. And so Sergeant Vasquez jumped on that 50, and as soon as he got a chance, there were trees in front of us. And so when he got a chance, he started firing, and we laughed about it later. He didn't stop firing fast enough and put a couple of shots through the kitchen truck canvas roof. But then he did hit the first tank, and it rolled into a ditch. And the rest of the group decided that they didn't want to go through that. So a couple of them tried to run and we shot them. But then they captured 17 Germans. We aren't even in combat yet. I'm not even in a tank. But it was a couple of days after that that the first sergeant came and sent me up and he said, "You're going to be a loader." And I got in the tank as a loader.
Well, what did you do with those 17 prisoners?
I have no idea. They would have given them to the infantry somewhere along the way because they had them on another, I think they had them on a tank recovery unit or something like that sitting there. And
well, let me take you back for a minute to you're walking into Omaha Beach. You mentioned you had impregnated uniform. What was that?
Oh, we put on pregnated coveralls. They said, well, that's because the Germans might use gas. Well, the things didn't breathe. And so when we got up on the shore, man, we're sweating underneath this thing, and it was really terrible. So we all started taking off these impregnated coveralls and threw them in a big pile. And this Frenchman came out and said, "Could I have those?" We said, "Sure." So he started hauling all these coveralls away. And I've laughed about it since. He's probably still trying to get the wax out of those things, but it was we didn't need them. And the Germans weren't about to use gas. I mean, they were miles away, and we would, if they had, we wouldn't have got it. Which, incidentally, you know, you read the history of all that. They had that kind of a scare because they told us that, what was it, phosgene smelled like new cut grass. And one of these farmers had cut a field of something, and somebody got a whiff of that and said, "Oh my goodness, it must be phosgene," and screamed gas. And everybody from there up to the front line was looking around, where'd I put that gas mask? But it wasn't gas at all. I don't think the Germans ever used gas in World War II. But anyway.
Let me take you on again. They tell you you're going to be a loader. So go on from there.
Oh, so they put me in the tank as a loader.
What kind of tank?
It was a Sherman, an M4. In that tank and all the tanks I was in after that, there was no escape hatch for the loader. To get out of the turret, the tank commander get out first, the gunner get out second, and the loader then would dip underneath the recoil guard on the cannon, and he was the third one out. Once I get in that tank, I don't know what the thought ever went through my mind. It probably did. Why would they just need one more person in that loading in that tank? But something happened to the previous loader, and I never asked, and they never volunteered why. All I know was they said, "Okay, you're the loader," and I knew what to do as the loader.
Well,
so
where did you keep your shells? Where did you keep your ammunition in the tank?
Yeah, I knew where it all was, and I knew how to do it. I knew which was which. They're between armor piercing and what was the other, high explosive, and they had one in there that was smoke, but we never used it.
Well, how many shells did your tank usually have?
You know, I couldn't tell you right off. I should know that, but I don't.
Are we talking 20 or 30 or more?
Oh yeah. And
what caliber was your cannon?
75 millimeter. I never was in a tank that had anything other than a 75 millimeter. They came out after a while with a 76, and finally during the Battle of the Bulge came up with a 90 millimeter, but the only one I ever had was 75. So after I got in the tank, we fought a couple of times there yet in France, and then one night we started to drive, and we drove all night. We'd stop, get gas in the tank, and then take off. And the next morning, towards daylight, we were in Mons, Belgium. And I think the Big Red 1 was part of the group that was there, but the 3rd Armored Division was the big one. And we had Mons surrounded. A few Germans tried to get out, which was a fatal mistake, but they gave up finally, and I think it was something like 25,000 Germans that surrendered. A couple of them were generals, high-ranking officers, and they put them all out in the field. And when my tank left, we were there 2 days. When my tank left, we went down, these prisoners are out there in that field. And the story went around, the Army was always full of rumors, that the story went around that a couple of generals, and they may put them out there with these lower ranking individuals, and that the Germans complained about, they were officers and they should be treated special, like, you couldn't put them out there with these privates and that sort of thing. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they said. Then we went on from there to Hue, Namur, liberated Liège, and then finally came the Siegfried Line. And the only thing that the loader has is this periscope, and you could turn it all the way around, you could lift it up and down, and that was my view of the outside world when I was the loader. And so when we weren't being shot at and the tank wasn't banging around any, I could look out there and see what was ahead of us or on either side of us. So I have some memories of getting up to the Siegfried Line and looking down, and all you could see in both directions, as far as you could see, were all those dragon's teeth that the Germans had put there. And so anyway, we got through the Siegfried Line. Now,
how did you get through there? These are concrete barriers, aren't they?
Yes, but the road had other kind of deterrents to keep you out. But I think our infantry and engineers took care of that, and there wasn't a terrible awful lot of fight, from what I understand, because it happened ahead of me. Because when we got there, we weren't even being shot at. And we came down, and there was a T intersection. We came to this T intersection. And then we did exactly what they told you in basic training never to do, and that's to stop at the T intersection, because the Germans would have it zeroed in. But sure enough, we stopped, and then all of a sudden, all hell broke loose with artillery coming in. And so then my platoon and another platoon were ordered to go off to the right. So we went off to the right, came to a small German village, and the other platoon went on the out. It was a real small village. It had maybe 6 or 8 houses on each side of the road. It's what all it consisted of. So the group that I was with, the 4 tanks that I was with, went on down through this town. The other 4 went up the outside of the thing in this big open field. And over here on the side was a slag pile of stuff they brought out of the coal mines. And what they didn't know was the Germans had anti-tank stuff in there. And so all of a sudden, we were almost through this village where the people I'm looking in there because we weren't being shot at, and they're hanging white sheets out the window to surrender. And about that time, though, over the radio, we saw all this screaming and yelling. And the Germans had started shooting these tanks, and they were like shooting ducks in a shooting gallery. They just bang, 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 and got all 4 of those tanks. And then we were ordered immediately to return, so we turned around and came back towards that T intersection and pulled off in there. And we stayed there a day or so. I think maybe just the second day, the Germans mounted up an attack to drive us back through the other side of the Siegfried Line, and that's when my first tank was hit. And
did anybody try to eliminate the anti-tank guns that had taken out those 4 tanks?
I don't think so. No, I don't know, but I don't think so. I think we just got back where they were shooting off this way, and we got back around here where they couldn't shoot at us. but we pulled off there, and of course, you know, I'm still, all I got is that little periscope to look out. So we pulled off in this field, and all of a sudden, well, the Germans decided to mount a counterattack. And when that started, boy, we were just shooting as fast as we could shoot with 30 caliber machine guns and cannon shells, and I'm as busy as I could be. And then all of a sudden, I had to change a barrel in the 30 caliber machine gun because we were firing so much it got hot, and we were getting ruptured cartridges. So finally, I pulled it out of battery, took the barrel out, hot barrel. I had asbestos gloves, and I gave that down to the bow gunner, and he gave me a cool barrel. I put that in, put it back in, armed it again, and then so it was available, and they fired a few rounds, and then all of a sudden we stopped shooting altogether, and I heard a voice outside the tank. What the world is that? And my tank commander climbed out, and this lieutenant climbed in. And the lieutenant put on his throat mic and his earphones, and then just stood there and just stared straight ahead. And finally then, Lieutenant Dingley, the platoon leader, called over the radio and said, "Lieutenant, back up, they're shooting at you." And about that time I did look out, and this big ball of fire just went by like that, and I, wow. And then Lieutenant Dingley called again and said, "Lieutenant, back up, they're shooting at you." And he didn't do anything. He just stood there and stared straight ahead. And Dingley called again, and this time he reached up and he grabbed his mic and said, "Driver, back up," and bang, just like that, that shell went through and killed the gunner and the tank commander, this lieutenant. And of course, my way out is to get past them. And so I'm trying to get these two dead bodies apart, which I can't do, they're heavy. And I'm on my knees getting underneath this, or not exactly on my knees, but ducked away under, and I can't get them. But out of my peripheral vision, I saw daylight, because the driver had gotten out and his hatch was open. So I dove down there, out over the side. Now, back during basic training, I'd been in a Jeep accident and dislocated my shoulder. And by the time I get overseas, it had been out of whack a few times. So anytime I used it, that usually happened. And so I dove over the side of the tank to get out of it. When I caught myself on the ground, the shoulder came out like this, and I popped my shoulder back in, and I started to get away from the tank. It was still going choke, backing up because the driver had left it in reverse. And so I started to run, and I tripped on something. It was either a root or a wire, or we may have run over a fence or something. Anyway, I fell down again, and reached over and pulled my shoulder back in. And when I did, I noticed I was bleeding. And so I ran over to this light tank, and I said, "Give me a Band-Aid, give me a bandage." And he said, "Come up and get it." And I said, "Okay." So I climbed up. The hand came out with a bandage. That's all he was going to expose, and I don't blame him. There was a lot of stuff happening. So anyway, I climbed up, and just about the time I'm reaching up to get that, it was tuck, 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 right up the side, and this German shot at me with a German submachine gun. We called them burp guns by the sound they made. And he missed me maybe 8 or 10 inches. But I looked real fast, and I saw where he was, and I yelled at the light tank commander. I said, "There's a big pile of bushes over there. That's where he is. He's under there." And they swung that 37 around and bang, took care of him. Well, then I put the bandage on, and I'm looking around for some place to hide. Oh, the other two, the driver and the bow gunner that had gotten out, when I first get out, and I started to run right before I fell, they're standing off maybe 100 feet up here, and they said, "Lieutenant and Reeby?" And I shook my head, and they took off. Where they went, I don't know, because I was taking care of myself. But I found a foxhole that was about half dug, and I jumped in there. And then the dumb things that go through your mind, I'm thinking, now if I lay on my back, we're having to use air bursts. I said, they would hit my heart. That's not good. So if I lay on my stomach, they hit my spine. That's not good. So I lay on my side. So I'm in this thing, this half-dug foxhole, laying on my side. And all of a sudden I get this burning sensation on my rear end. And so I reached back. I thought, boy, I've been hit again. I reached back, and it was a hot piece of shrapnel was all it was. And about that time, here comes this medic standing straight up, you know, with his helmet with the Red Cross on it, a uniform. He said, "Can you walk?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay," and told me where to go. He said, "There's a ambulance back there." So I went back and got to this ambulance and got in. And they had one guy over here on the side who was really bad off. He couldn't stand up. He was laying down. And then there were three of us sitting on the other side. The guy who was over here was hurt so bad. And there was another wounded person sitting on the hood of this, which was really a half-track. And this guy over here yelled, said, "Driver," said, "don't go across that open field." Said, "That's where I got hit." Driver said, "Okay, buddy," and turned around like everyone right straight across the field. Of course, he couldn't see it, and we could, but he was taking the shortest distance between 2 points to get us to a field hospital, or evacuation place, really. So they dressed my wound, gave me the shot. My arm hurt worse than my leg did after the tetanus shot. They always hurt. Then they said, "Okay, there's a tent out there with some cots in it. Go pick out a cot." So I went in and picked out a cot, stayed overnight, and the next morning, a Jeep came, took me back up to the company CP, and the first sergeant walked up and said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Tank got hit." He said, "Anybody get killed?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Reevy and the lieutenant." And he stood there for a minute, and I thought he had tears coming up in his eyes, because he and Reevy were both old Army, and they'd both been boxers. And back, you know, in pre-war days, they would have all these contests between different companies and platoons and one thing and another. And he and Reevy were really good friends. And what he knew that I didn't know at the time was that Reevy had a brother killed in North Africa. And one of my stories, when I've given talks now and then, is, you know, there are two kinds of heroes. And Reevy, once his brother was killed, he could have asked for another assignment other than being up on the front line in a tank. But he didn't do that. He was a tank gunner, and he stayed with what he did. So you had to give him credit for that.
Now, how do you spell his last name?
Reavy.
Where had you first met him? Was he just, it was in your first crew?
He was the gunner when I first got in that tank.
Okay.
Yeah. He was a nice guy. He's buried down in Kentucky in a national cemetery.
Well, let me take you back. You had mentioned that you were involved in a couple of battles on your way up to the Siegfried Line. Can you tell us a little bit about those encounters?
Not that I remember a lot. Most of it was machine guns, because we were going through these cities and they'd say, "Put something up there in the upstairs window," or something, you know, if they thought they were being shot at from there, that sort of thing. And then some of the times my platoon would be in reserve, where we wouldn't be doing anything, but up in the platoon in front of us would be shooting at tanks or whatever. But we of course were getting artillery fire, that sort of thing. What I'm trying to think of. They dropped the shell. Mortars. The brain, you know, I'm 100 years old now, so I got an excuse if I can't think of a word. But anyway, then we didn't get any really big skirmishes. But we just went through a few of these towns. And so anyway, that's what I remember. And, you know, I'm locked up in that tank, and I don't know what's going on, what they're shooting at or anything.
Well, when you guys got hit by that shell and the lieutenant got killed,
yeah,
and Was there smoke and fire in the tank, or what was the atmosphere like?
In my mind, it was like it suddenly was black, you know, like it was, but it may have just been the shock, because there was a terrible shock and a terribly loud bang when that shell hit. And so it just, you know, I was stunned there for a second or two about what just happened. You know, and then I look over and hear these two bodies over there, both of them obviously dead. And then I realized I got to get out of here. And then, well, I told you how I went through that.
So then, you know, the Germans had tried to counterattack there at the Siegfried line, and you repelled.
Yeah.
You repelled them. And
okay. Well, then I'm back. After I got wounded, I'm back with the first sergeant. And so he said, "Well, Walter, just take it easy for a while. Just lay down there in the grass, take it easy." So I did, but I wasn't there in the grass very long before he came back again. He said, "Walter," said, "I hate to do this to you, but," he said, "you know, we have a chance to get a tank." And he said, "You know how badly they need tanks." And I said, "I sure do." So he said, "Okay," he said, "I got you a guy here, a driver," and said, "The two of you will ride you back in the Jeep and you pick up that tank and bring it back." So we went back and picked up the tank, and I was the tank commander. Didn't need to do anything, just look out, and we drove back and pulled up in that tank, and the first sergeant came up again and said, "Walter," said, "I really hate to do this to you," but he said, "You're the gunner in this tank." And I said, "Okay." So I was back up the next day. 24 hours later, I'm right back up in the front line, only this time I'm the gunner. And there wasn't a lot of fighting immediately after that. Both sides were up against it for having frontline personnel. And so we were just kind of eyeing each other. And one of the things that does stick in my mind was I'm sitting there in my gunner's seat, and I write a letter home to my mother, or to the family. And I put up here, PFC Walter B. Stitt, and my tank commander, Sergeant Jones, said, "You're not a PFC." I said, "I'm not." He said, "No," he said, "gunners are corporals." So I scratch out PFC real fast and write CPL. And then the next letter I wrote home, I said, "Did you notice the change of address? And you know, I'm a corporal, big time operator, the lowest of the non-commissioned officers, but still, you know, I'm commanding the two people in front of me, the driver and the bow gunner and the loader."
Were you back in an M4 again? Was that an M4 you were back in? A Sherman tank?
Yeah. Yeah.
You got back in that again?
Yeah, it was. And so, anyway, Sergeant Jones was really the best tank commander of the 5 that I had. And so this is close to the end of September now, and we went back, pulled us back off the line, and we went back into this German little area there. And Sergeant Jones wanted to back our tank between 2 houses where we couldn't be observed, and give us some safety. And so he got out and was giving the driver directions, and all of a sudden a mortar shell hit just right beside him, and he just mangled his leg. And so we got him around the side of the tank, and then we called for medics, and they came and took Sergeant Jones, and then we called and said, "We need a tank commander." And about that time, here comes this Jeep, and they came up and they said, "Where's Sergeant Jones?" And I said, "Well, did you pass an ambulance on the way?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Well, that's Sergeant Jones." I said, "He got badly wounded." And they said, "Oh," said, "he just got a field commission. He's a 2nd lieutenant." And I said, "Well, catch up with him. He'll be glad to hear that." And so off they went. And so then we got my next tank commander, and last tank commander was John Fasula. And so the whole month of October, we just sat there. From that little place there between these two houses, we never did get it between the two houses. They pulled us up on the front line, and my tank went right up beside a house. This part of the front part of this house was pretty much destroyed. And we're right there just back off the top of the crest of a hill. And there's a pillbox over here about 150 feet away that still had Germans in it. And there's a platoon of infantry down the basement of this house. And you didn't dare get out of that house in daylight. If you got out, you could hear just almost immediately, you could hear, because these Germans were watching us. If they saw us get out, all they had to do was now, and the artillery fired right then, so that was it. So anyway, we were there about a week. And all we ever had was artillery that came in now and then. Oh, a fun part of that was there was a dead cow out in the field, all bloated up in that nice sun, and they hit it with some of that artillery. And if the wind was in the wrong direction, oh man, the odor was something else. So anyway, I did have one experience while we were there. I don't remember whether I put that in the book or not, but anyway, we didn't have any heater for our hot coffee. And so we yelled and said to these infantry inside, said, if we bring our water over, could you heat it for us? And they said, sure. So I said, now here's what we'll do. The tank commander backed out of the way, and I said, I'll jump out, you hand me the water, and I'll run over. I said, you get out as fast, right behind me and run over. I said, you get down, I'll hand you the water. And so that's what we did. Well, we made it across there, and here come these artillery shells, but we're inside then, it didn't bother us. So we went down the basement. Sure enough, the infantry down there had a little stove, one of these little Coleman heaters, and they heated up the water. So we got back up, and we're standing there against the wall, and the tank's out here. And I said, now here's what we'll do. I said, I'll run up, jump on top of the tank, you hand me the water, and I'll run over. And he was the loader, so he had to get in first. I said, well, run over. I said, you jump in, I hand you the water, I'll get in. Okay. So we just moved, and the Germans must have seen us move, even though we're inside this house and up against near the wall, because pretty soon we hear this artillery shell coming. Well, the kid who's holding this bucket of water just stands there and closes his eyes, and I dove down on the floor. But I had my eyes open, and I've laughed about since. I said I saw a chicken go through the air, and it wasn't flying. It went end over end. But anyway, I said, now! And we jumped out of there, and I jumped up on the tank. He hands me the hot water. I run over and stand there. He jumps in. I hand him the water. I get in, and we put our coffee grounds in there and stirred it up, and then when we drank it, we get down to the bottom, there was a piece of stuff that fell off the ceiling plaster in the bottom of that thing. It fallen in there when he had his eyes closed. So anyway,
all of that for a cup of coffee.
Yeah, all for a cup of coffee. So anyway, then they called and they said, you've been up there now for a week, and we're going to change crews, because they had us all along there. And he said, you're crew number 1. And said, this evening we'll call you when we want you to come back. And we said, okay. So sure enough, right after dark, when it made it difficult for these people over there to see us, they called and they said, crew number 1, come on back. So boy, we all bailed out of that tank, and off we went, following Sergeant Jones at that point. And when we got back there, Lieutenant hollered, halt, who goes there? I said, Sergeant Jones, sir. And he said, what's the password? And Jones said, sir, the only password I know is what you gave me last night. Okay, Sergeant Jones, come on. So we go on through, and we just gotten back into the woods a ways, and we heard the lieutenant holler, halt, who goes there? Then there's brup, brup, brup with a German patrol. And so he said he cut down, well, we heard him cut down with that submachine gun he had. But he said he thought he hit him, but he couldn't tell. It was getting dark. And one of the things they taught you in that infantry training was, if it's really dark and you lay flat on the ground, you can make out forms moving, you know, even if it's really dark, because the sky's a little lighter than, and so that's what this lieutenant was doing. He was smart enough, he was laying flat on the ground, and he saw these bodies coming towards him, and they weren't supposed to be there. Well, anyway, we got a tank, and that's went back, and that's when Sergeant Jones got his leg busted. It was when we left those woods in this tank and went back into the small village. So then when we got the next tank commander, John Fasula, I don't remember exactly where we were, but we weren't being shot at. They started giving us instructions about what we were going to do, and this now is 1st of November. We've gotten completely restocked with tanks. We had 15 tanks. The infantry had all the infantry they needed. We had food, we had gas, we had ammunition, we were ready to go. And so they said, here's what we're going to do. In that field where those 4 tanks were shot up, we were going to go right down through there. But at the far end of that thing was this minefield laid out. And it was laid out like a vegetable garden with wire like this in a path, and another square of wire, and then another path that was laid out that way. Trying to entice you into going down through the path between these wire places. And but a German officer defected. He'd gotten in trouble with Adolf, and he was going to be in trouble, so he came over to our side, and he said, when you get down there, he said, run over the wires, don't go through the path. He said, run over the wires because there's no mines in there. And so when they said go, and we started down, I'm watching, and my tank commander, John Fasula, start lining the driver up with a path. And I grabbed the mic and I said, John, I said, that German officer said to run over the wires, and he screamed at me. He was one of these people, he couldn't tell him anything. He said, I'm the tank commander. Okay, he was the tank commander. So off we went right down through that path, and that's when I lost my second tank, because it just, oh man, we were reared up in the air and back down again, and all the tracks and wheels on one side were gone. So anyway, they told you in basic training, if you're in a minefield in a tank and you hit a mine, climb out the back over the tracks, because you know you've run over everything there. Well, we get out and I'm looking, I'm only counting 4 of us. And so I stood there and I leaned around, and sure enough, the driver, who had been in my previous tank, just jumped right out into the minefield. And I screamed at him. I said, don't move, don't move. He said, what's the matter? I said, look at your foot. Here's this prong sticking up. He just missed it. So then he climbed on the tank and got off. And the driver, bow gunner, and loader all took off on a dead run, and which I can't blame them for. But John Fasula and I started to walk back, and all of a sudden I heard this zip, zip, zip. And I screamed, John, they're shooting at us. And boy, we took off. And ran for maybe 100 yards at a high speed to get back out of that field, and again back into the woods where we couldn't get shot at. So it took almost, I think 2, maybe almost 3 weeks, probably a little over 2 weeks, to get another tank for us, because we lost so many of them. We lost another 3 or 4 in that tank field by people doing the same thing, running down that path. They brought up, when that happened, Colonel Lovelady came up and had them bring up the flail. Now the flail had these chains on there that they could run down through there, and they would set off all these mines. They brought the flail up, and the flail broke down and wouldn't work. So finally somebody ran over the wires, and then the rest of them went through like a bunch of elephants on a circus and fought each other, and they got the rest of the company through there, and off they went. Well, with my tank done, as I said, it was about 3 weeks before we got another tank. And then we went around that minefield, caught up with our company, and pulled our tank up next to a barn on a German farm, and there were no people in the house, so we could use it through the day, but at night the Germans were sending planes over and dropping anti-personnel mines, things like that, so we spent the evenings, the nights in the tank. It was safer. And but we weren't being shot at. The whole division then had gone into reserve. I think the 8th Armored Division went through us and took up the frontline positions. And then all of a sudden we get a call to mount up and get in position because the Germans have made a breakthrough in Belgium. And so I talked with Colonel Lovelady after the war. He and I became friends. And he said he got an order to take all of his 33rd Armored Regiment, and go down to a certain mark on the map. Gave him the coordinates on the map and said, wait there and get further instruction. Well, said he waited 2 hours when he got there and said, we got to do something. We can't just sit here. And so they just didn't know which way to go. I mean, the Germans were just going all different directions. So we started out, and in E Company, we were the 5th tank, and we went around this corner like this. The 1st tank did, and here's a German column going by, and so his tank commander, this new tank commander, was his lieutenant, first day in combat, and he told him to load a high explosive. It's because the last thing that went by was one of these 88s behind a truck. They could put a hole right through our tank, and so they loaded the 1st tank, loaded the high explosive in there. And then he ordered the driver to speed down the hill, and the driver did, and turned around the corner. Well, the Germans had to get out of the truck that was pulling the gun. They had to level the gun. They had to get the ammunition in the gun, and that was taking them time. And our tank came around that 1st tank, fired a shell, killed the Germans, and then fired another shell into the tank. And it was like the 4th of July there in December, because the truck had all this ammunition and stuff in it. So anyway, it caught fire, and we waited there for 45 minutes or better. And then finally they said, okay, we can go around it now. Said most of the stuff's exploded. So the 1st tank went up and dropped down in the ditch and back up on the road. The next one, same thing. Well, in the meantime, my tank, the 5th tank, and I'm sitting there, and I had the thing on electric traverse, so I could turn the turret by hand. Instead of cranking it, I could turn it just by the switch. But the thing was noisy, so I shut it off. And I forgot that I'd shut it off, so when we went down the ditch, the barrel went right around into the bank. So I quickly corrected that, and then we get out on the road, and we had to wait. Wanted to look in the barrel, make sure there was no dirt in there. So we checked the barrel, and then we started down the road as fast as we could go to catch up with those first 4 tanks. And by the time we got into the village, they stopped us right there, somebody did. Those first 4 tanks had gone down trying to catch up with this German column, went under a railroad pass, and the Germans had enough time with our delay that they were waiting for them. And sure enough, those first 4 tanks got under there, and they picked them all off and killed the lieutenant who was a platoon leader on his 1st day in combat. So then they just assigned my tank to Colonel Elliott's, or Lieutenant Elliott's platoon, and we stayed there. This village was Trépont, and we stayed there a few days, and there wasn't much to fight there. The infantry was taking care of that, so they moved us down to another village a few miles down the road. It was called Petit-Coup. Petit, of course, in French means small, and coup in German means cow. So whether was named after a small cow, I don't know. But we stood there in Pettigrew, and my tank and a light tank went between these houses and set side by side, where we had a clear view of this big open field, sloped field like this, with trees across the top. And all of a sudden, the way I remember it was sometime after lunch, out of these woods come these German SS troopers. And we found out later, we didn't know right then, that they had orders not to take prisoners because they couldn't take care of prisoners. They couldn't feed them, they couldn't spare the people to watch them. So they said, you know, they're handicapped, just shoot the prisoners. That's why they shot all those people at Malpre, because they were told not to take prisoners, just shoot them. So anyway, we started killing these Germans, and you could tell which ones you hit and which ones were faking it and just took a dive down on the ground. Because when you hit them, you know, they just collapsed and rolled on down. So we'd wait, and the guy would stand up again, we'd shoot him then. And years later, we went back to that same Pettigrew, and we asked one of the villagers, said, when you get up on that hill after that battle was over, said, how many bodies did you find? Well, he said 70, but I don't think there were that many. But there were quite a few of those SS troopers that we finished off. But finally then, it was starting to get dark. It was we didn't want to be there because we didn't have any infantry, and we didn't want to be there and take our chances with bazookas and Panzerfaust and that sort of thing. And they were starting to drop mortars in on us, so we moved our tanks out of there. And it was after that town right there that Colonel Piper decided to go back to Germany and took his troops on back. So we went from there. Then about that time, decided to go down to help the Band of Brothers. So we were on a road going down that direction. And we would take a town today and then another town the next day, because there were Germans we had to take care of along the way. And so then I get down to Freiture, probably French say Frature, I don't know, but we get down, we called it Freiture. My tank, again, is the last tank into town. My tank commander, John Fasula, there's this field we were heading across, and the houses over here. He said, put a shell in that upper window. So I put a high explosive shell in that upper window. And then he told the driver to pull up as close as you can get to the house, alongside the house. And he tossed a hand grenade in another window upstairs. If there are any Germans, you wanted to chase them out. And it worked, because a German came out the front and we shot him. And then we weren't going to just sit there, so we went across this little road, up over a small stone fence, and stopped. And we were getting small arms fire over here. So I swung the cannon around. Well, we shot the German first, then we turned my cannon over this way to shoot another house where they were getting small arms fire from and machine gun fire from. And when I did, this guy stood up down here and fired a Panzerfaust, and he missed the tank altogether. But that morning when we started out, we had 8 brand new 83rd infantry with us, and they had a platoon commander, but he got hit right off the bat. So here they are, first day in combat, never fired a shot at anybody, and they don't know what to do, so they're falling along with my tank. And when they're getting shot at, they get up close to the tank. So anyway, when this guy fired his Panzerfaust, one kid got a real bad leg. One kid got hit right underneath his nose, and boy, was bleeding like a stuck pig. And I can still hear him screaming, there he is, there he is, there he is, because the guy stood up to shoot again. And instead of shooting him, they all had rifles. They just pointed at him. And so he fired that second one, which hit right behind my head. Now I'm leaning forward sight out that the gun so I can hit him, but I wasn't over far enough yet that I could shoot him. And so the shell hit on top of the tank right behind my head. So I got shrapnel on my head, but the shell killed my tank commander, John Fasula, instantly. And he fell down on top of me and then slid down onto the floor. So I got out, and the driver, bow gunner, and the loader came out behind me. And these infantry are just standing there. And I screamed. I've made a joke out of it that's one of the few times that I got to pull my rank on people, because they were all BFCs. I screamed at it, get in the house. So we ran in the house and we patched each other up. And then when we got done putting patches on everybody, I'm standing there, and all of a sudden I realized my head feels cold and went like this, came down as blood. So I asked somebody, one of the guys, I said, how bad am I hit? And I said, doesn't look bad. Oh, that scared me right there. But anyway, the kid, his leg was bad. I said, get on my back. So he got on my back, and I walked across this field that we just had come across, and got on the road and up in the trees so we couldn't get shot at. And a Jeep came by with Major Stallings, who had been shot in the back. And they picked us up, took us up to the medic's first place and dropped us off, and then they took off. He took off with the major to get him to the hospital in a hurry. And we went inside and sat down, and the kid with the bad leg is sitting next to me, and I'm sitting on the floor. And he's still bleeding, even though we had a bandage on him. You can see he was still bleeding. And all of a sudden the door opened and a guy ran in and said, Doc, he said, I got room for one more in his ambulance. And the doctor looked at me and said, you go with him. And I said, sir, I said, he's really bleeding bad. And he said, I said, you go with him. Okay. So I go out and get in. And I'm really sure then I must be dying. So I got back to the hospital, and they put me up there. I think they cut some of the hair away first, then he started pulling these pieces of shrapnel out of my skull. Now when I say that, that indicates that I have a hard head, but I'll say it anyway. So they took these pieces out, and I could hear him drop them in some kind of a tin pan. And I said, could I have one of those? And so he gave me a sample, and I stuck it in my pocket. And that's what I have in my souvenirs. And so then they said, there's a room over there with beds. Said, go there and get yourself a bed and take it easy. So I go in there, and there's 2 or 3 other guys in there in these cots. And we're all taking life easy now. We're not being shot at. And laying there, and all of a sudden this sergeant came in and said, okay, come on, get out. I got a truck out here, get in a truck. And we're all getting this thing about, oh, we're wounded, we're supposed to be resting. And you know how it goes in the Army. He said, I said, get your ass in the truck. So, okay, he's a sergeant. So off we go. And he took me back up to my company. And so I stayed there that night and the next day. And then the following night, I really came down with a bad case of dysentery. And I think I was up like 11 times during the night. And the next morning I'm lying there and I'm feeling terrible and weak. And first sergeant came over and said, Walter, said, I'm gonna send you back up. Said, you're gonna be a tank commander. And I said, I don't wanna be a tank commander. He said, you'll be a sergeant right away. And I said, I've had 5 tank commanders. He said, all I want is to be a gunner. He said, well, okay, you can be the gunner. He said, but breakfast is ready, come on. I sat up, and when I sat up, I passed out. I flopped back down, and then I think I came to fairly quickly. And he said, what's the matter? And I said, well, I was up all night going to the John, and I said, I just felt terribly weak. And he said, well, come on, get up. And I tried to get up, and my legs didn't want to work. I was really dehydrated, or no question about it. So we called medics, and the medics came over, one on each side, took me across the street to a Belgian house, and got my shoes off and popped into bed. And about that time, this dear, sweet Belgian lady came up with a warm brick she'd had on the stove, put that down by my feet, and I was ready to spend the rest of the war right there in that bed with my feet on that warm brick, because, oh, it was cold. And so anyway, then they came back later with an ambulance and took me over to Liège, to a hospital. And I think what happened was, they saw that I'd already been wounded twice, and I was complaining about, can you do anything with this shoulder that keeps coming out of joint? And I think they thought, well, I must be complaining, and so they decided I'd had enough combat, and they sent me on back to Paris. Well, I got in Paris, and I told this kid, I said, they were feeding me bismuth and paregoric to take care of the diarrhea. And I told this male nurse, I guess he was a nurse, or anyway, I said, well, I'm getting better on that. I said, I guess I can go back. He said, you're not going back. I said, why? I said, well, you know what's the matter with you? And I said, no. I said, I tried to get my shoulder fixed, and that's about it. Oh, no, he said, you're too combat fatigue or whatever it was. I said, you're nuts. Well, next thing you know, I'm on a ship going back to England. And they took me back to a hospital, and still complaining about my shoulder, because there's anything you can do with that shoulder. And they kept me under observation for about a month at this hospital, and then discharged me to a replacement depot again, and where I was assigned on limited service. Well, I got to tell you one of my stories from being in the hospital. They brought in an English soldier who had dropped a gun on his toe and smashed it really bad, but they didn't have any room in the English hospital, which we had taken over. So they sent him there, and this poor kid's laying there in bed with his big tent over his knees so nothing touched that sore toe. And they started bringing in food, and they brought in coffee. And I said, would you like tea? And he said, yes, I sure would. So I got a hold of the nurse and told her, I said, is there any way you can get tea bags? And she said, sure. So she called and got us a whole box of tea bags. So every time we had meals after that, for the time that he and I were together there, I would fix he and the two of us a cup of tea every day, every meal. And then when he got to the place where he dared to put any weight on his foot, he showed me how to shoot darts, so I'd have a half a chance if I got in a dart game. So anyway, then I got discharged from there, went to this replacement depot, and then they transferred me to the 95th Bomb Group in the 8th Air Force. When I got there, this major said, oh, he said, I see you're a gunner. He said, we'll make you an armorer. Well, that sounded great to me. You know, I knew something about guns. So I went over where I was supposed to go, and I found out that armorers don't have anything to do with guns. The armorers loaded bombs. And the guns in the airplanes, the gunners wanted to take care of their own guns to make sure it was done right. And so I ended up loading bombs. So here I am with a shoulder that I can't put over my head. I even had trouble climbing into the 17s, but I figured out a way to do that without throwing my arm out of joint every time, my shoulder. They said, you just get up there, Walter, on the catwalk and crank these things up and hook the shackles. That's all I had to do. So I did that for a while. It had its interesting moments too. I was loading up a 500-pound bomb, and somebody said something to me, and I turned. When I did, I pulled the crank off there, and down that thing went, hit on that trailer, and I dove backward and banged my head. And the guys on the ground started laughing. Said, Walter said, if that 500-pound bomb went off, said, you think diving backwards is going to save you? But anyway.
Well, how long did you do that arming?
I did that not more than a few weeks, I don't think. But I loaded napalm bombs. Boy, that was scary because they were kind of soft. And then I loaded food to go to France, or to
Belgium?
Then to Belgium, yeah.
What air base were you working out of?
It was the 95th Bomb Group, and it was stationed near a village called Horham. And so anyway, I went back to the officer that made that assignment and told him the trouble I was having with trying to lift any bombs or get my hand over my head. And he said, okay, he said, I'll reassign you to the PX. So that was a good deal because all I had to lift was a carton of cigarettes. And I was really more than they needed there at the PX because they had enough personnel. So if I wanted to go to town, all I had to do was go to the lieutenant and say, I'm going to go into London. And he'd say, well, just sign out. You know, it was never any problem. Of course, the only time I had money to do that was payday. So I was there working in the PX, and then had a very interesting experience on VE Day when the war was over. I'd been in London, and I came back to the base out of money, walked into the day room to sign in, and there was this kid in there. Well, I call him a kid, he was my age. I don't remember whether they had a broom or a mop, but whatever it was, he looked up at me and said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, being smart aleck, I said, I'm supposed to get a pass. Well, I thought he'd say, oh yeah, sure, you know, something like that. He said, you supposed to get a pass? And I said, yeah. He said, okay. He went over and tore a pass out. And I think he stamped it because it had a signature on it and gave it to me. So instead of signing in, I just changed the date that I was signing out. I ran back over to my Quonset hut, told the guys over there, and they said that, well, three of them went with me right back over and out of town. I'd borrowed some money and I could go back to London. And we all jumped on the train, went to London. And so all those pictures you've seen of London with all the hundreds of thousands of people crammed there in Piccadilly Circus, I was among them. And I've laughed about since, if you got your hands in the air, you couldn't get them down, you got them down, couldn't get them up. But before we did that, once we get off the subway, the underground, this guy said, I know a place we can get a bottle of whiskey up on Rainbow Street. Okay, so we go up to this place he knew, and he knocked on the door, and the guy opens it with a couple of those chain locks and said, what the hell you want? I said, I want to get a bottle of whiskey. You know, okay, he unlocks the door, and the kid goes in, comes out with a bottle of whiskey. And so we're standing there in front of this place. It was like a stoop up about 2 stairs, then this little stoop, and passing this thing around. Well, I did not like whiskey, didn't drink whiskey, but I wasn't going to look dumb, so I took a sip. And about that time, Bobby came by. And one of these guys said, officer, said, would you like a little shot of whiskey? And he looked up and said, well, he said, ordinarily, he said, I wouldn't drink when I'm on duty, but he said, today is a very special day. And he stepped up on that stoop, took that thing, went glunk, 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 and then handed it back. And so we laughed, and then they had a few more rounds, and off we went. Somewhere along the way, I got separated from those 3 guys in the crowd, and I walked down to Leicester Square, and it was getting towards evening, and I was standing there, and there was a woman standing there with a young child, maybe he must have been 5 or 6, somewhere along there. She's holding his hand, and they had not had the lights on in Leicester Square for 5 years, and all of a sudden the lights came on, and she started to cry. Well, I'd had a little nip of whiskey and probably had a couple of pints of beer, and so I joined her, but it was a very moving moment to think that there wouldn't be any more bombs, no more running to air raid shelters, no more bodies back home. It was just a very tender moment, and I was pleased that I was there. I think I remember, I've said I do, and I'm pretty sure I do, getting down to Green Park later on, and they had a big bonfire. And I do remember the bonfire, and I think they had park benches in it, but that's neither here nor there. So anyway, I ran out of money the next day and went on back to the base. And then with the war over in Europe, they started sending the planes and crews back. And one day the lieutenant at the PX came in and said, Walter, said, I'm putting you in charge of the enlisted men's beer hall, which is right next door to the PX. So that was a job you really would love. So all I had to do was to get a vehicle, get down to the railroad station. I had a friend, another guy from West Virginia, and he and I would get to roll the barrels off the railroad onto the truck, take them back, roll them up on the stand, and then plug them in and sell the beer. Well, they didn't all pay for the beer because someone would say, I don't have any money, and we just don't worry about it. And so I did that until the war was over, or until time to go home, which was in August. Again, I got on the Queen Elizabeth, only this time instead of being on D deck, on the lower deck, I was right up in the front, where in peacetime it was round. I think it was a bar and probably had glass where you could see where the ship was going. Slept on the floor up there. And this time, no zigzag, it went right straight back. Went back the same way to Fort George Meade, and then they gave me a pass for 30 days and the fare for the railroad, or a pass for the railroad. I got on the train and was in going through Pennsylvania, and the train slowed down and stopped, and people threw newspaper up on the train with big headlines that Japan had surrendered. So when the train got to Pittsburgh, I had to get off of the Pennsylvania Railroad and get on the B&O. I came up on the street and there was a police officer standing there. And I said, Officer, where can I get a cab? Oh, son, he said, you won't get a cab tonight. And I said, well, he said, where you got to go? And I said, well, I got to go to the B&O station. He said, it's about a mile, just right straight down this street. I said, okay. So I walked that mile down, got the train to B&O. And when I got to where we lived in Elm Grove, which was suburban Wheeling, I said, the conductor came by and I said, does this train stop in Elm Grove? And he said, no, it doesn't ordinarily, but he said, tonight it stops. And reached up and pulled the chain a couple times, and the train stopped, and I get out, there's not a soul around. Everybody's downtown in Wheeling, including my parents, waiting down at the train station for me to get there. And so anyway, I had to walk home, which is over a half a mile. And when I got home, my parents never locked the door. And so I walked in and turned on the lights and went out in the kitchen and fried myself an egg and a piece of toast and a glass of milk. And my father and mother, when they decided I wasn't getting off the train, went on home. And when they pulled up by the house, my mother yelled at my father. She said, I thought you turned out all the lights. And he said, I did turn them all out. So then they came in, and there was their dear son returned from the war. And I had a 30-day furlough.
So, well, let me take you for a few minutes back to
sure.
back to your battles. Now, in that tank, how many rounds could you fire in a minute out of your cannon?
If you fired one after another, fire, reach, slam, it wouldn't take you more than 10 seconds to fire a second round. It was just a matter of reaching back and grabbing the ammunition and slamming it in. The gunner, if he wanted to do that, if he was in a hurry to fire, could just hold the trigger down. So as soon as your shell hit there, it triggered the breech to close and fire. As soon as the breech, it would just bang, bang, bang like that. So you could fire quite a few in a hurry.
Did you have any trouble with the barrel heating up?
No, I never had trouble with the barrel heating up.
You were talking about the German offensive. Was that the Battle of the Bulge in November and December of 44?
That was yes.
You remember it being real cold then where you were?
Oh yeah, it was really cold, yeah.
What kind of equipment did you have?
The field that we went into, where I got shot the last time, was, had about a foot of snow. It was cold. It was really cold.
Well, I understand that during that winter, the Army hadn't provided you with very much as far as winter-type clothing.
No, well, some of them didn't have much clothing at all. I don't remember, being too terribly cold with what I had to wear. We got blankets in the tank too, so you could cover yourself with a blanket. It's the way we slept comfortably, with just a stack of blankets so we could lean up against it and sleep.
Mm-hmm. Well, thinking back on it, what was your worst experience over there?
I think the worst experience was when that first tank got hit, and I was trying to struggle against 2 dead bodies, and it was. I didn't take time to look at all their wounds or anything like that. It was just what I saw momentarily and realized that I was stuck and I couldn't get out that way. It was just, a moment of panic, and I said, I got to get out of here. And that was probably the worst. Now, it was bad when John Fasula fell on me and slumped down on the floor. That's terrible too. It was sad learning later other friends in the company that got killed subsequent to that, because the war went on for a few more months.
Well, tell me about your love life. Did you have a girlfriend in high school, or?
I did, and she was not all that nuts about Walter, but she did write occasionally. And as soon as I got home after the war was over, she broke up with us. She wasn't real taken with me as a husband prospect.
So when you got home, when did you look for work, and what kind of job did you get?
Well, as soon as I got home after the war, I went down and registered to vote, and then my father took me down to Marietta College. And they accepted me as a student. And so then the first week in January of 1940, what would it have been, 40?
Ended in 45, so you're in 46.
46. First week in January 46, I was a freshman at Marietta College. I went to Marietta on and off. Well, I was there 2 years, and then I thought I had TB because I had a spot on my lung, and I was gone for the rest of that year. Spent 9 months in a TB sanitarium up in Dover, Pennsylvania, and then I went back, and I didn't know what I really wanted to do, and I wasn't getting very good grades. And so I talked with the dean, and he said, why don't you just drop out for a while? So I dropped out, went back to Wheeling, got a job with a construction company, and they said if I would be willing to start at the bottom and learn the job, they could get me up to being a superintendent. So that's what I did, and I started out pick and shovel like everybody else, and they kept giving me different jobs, and finally they made me labor foreman, and I did a few jobs at that. Then they got a big job down in Morgantown, West Virginia, and I went down there and I was the timekeeper, paymaster, labor foreman. Well, I didn't do much labor forming. They showed me how to use a transit to shoot levels, because the bridge was 60 feet in the air and they had to get all this underpinning in there before they could pour the concrete. So I did that, and then I met my wife and got married.
Now, where did you meet her?
Huh?
Where did you meet her?
She was my sister's roommate at Marietta, and she came to our house one Thanksgiving weekend, rather than going all the way to Cleveland where her parents lived. And my sister insisted I date her, and I fought that, but finally my father knew her father. They'd gone to college together at Marietta, and he got on my back, and then my mother said, Walter, now it wouldn't hurt you at all to date Betty, and so I finally gave in and dated her. Ended up I liked her, and we had about 4 more of those weekend dates, and I asked her to marry me, and she said yes, and so we got married in the following June. She got married on the day she graduated because all the people she wanted for her bridesmaids were there, and so we did that, got married. We were married, lived in Wheeling for about another month. Then I took another job with Wheeling Steel, got out of construction, which would sometimes take you away from town for a whole week, and a newly married man doesn't want that. So I took a job with Wheeling Steel in Columbus as a salesman.
What was Betty's maiden name?
I'm sorry?
Betty's maiden name?
Her maiden name was Elizabeth Estelle Bailey.
B-A-I-L-E-Y?
Yeah. And she graduated from Marietta College, cum laude, as an English teacher, and which probably saved us later on because there were times when she brought in the money when I was here at Wittenberg University and the seminary.
So she had a teaching career then?
Yes, she did. She taught for 35 years, and when she retired, then I retired from parish ministry.
So where did you go to school for ministry training?
Here in Springfield at Wittenberg then had seminary, Hamma School of Theology.
H-A-M-M-A?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And how long did that study take?
I was here 5 years. I had to finish the undergraduates that I didn't finish at Marietta College, and then I had to do 3 years in the seminary.
And you finished that in what, 65?
I finished in 65, and my first parish was in Louisville. I was there 12 years. And when the government said that Kentucky could no longer have separate but equal, boy, the place went wild. All these people decided that busing all these students was the worst thing that ever happened to this world, that the buses would kill the kids, they'd wreck and all. It just went on and on. And right there where my parish was, every night they were out there burning tires in the middle of the road. And of course the TV came out and these people screamed and yelled about how bad this was to do away and to have busing and mix all these races together like that. And it just went on and on. Well, at that point I went down, I'd been for 12 years going to the churches, what do you call it, where all the churches get together. Anyway, they changed the name of it. But anyway, we came up with the idea of having a committee called Peaceful Desegregation. And somehow along the way I got elected the president of that group. So the young man who did the religion page for the Courier Journal came out, interviewed me, took my picture, and I thought, well, this is great because this will be on the religion page. And the next morning I started getting phone calls and called me all kinds of names. And what in the world is going on? And then when I got my newspaper, discovered that my picture was on the front page with this article about, I thought it was about time that they had school integration. There were a lot of black folks that lived a mile or so beyond where my parish was, and they bused those poor kids 7 or 8 miles downtown to a school that had a football field with no track around it. They only had like 4 sinks in the science thing because, you know, black kids wouldn't need to take science courses. And incidentally, when they were forced to do it, they all of a sudden, all these things happened. They put in a swimming pool, they did more sinks, and they put a track around. They said it was all in the planning, and we all said, yeah, sure. But anyway, getting back to what I started to say, with my name and all that on there, and I started getting all these calls, and I got a guy that would call and say, you have 6 days to live. And I didn't tell my wife. And I said, well, he's getting his jolly, he's just calling me. And so I never did anything about it till one day I was in the bathroom shaving and my wife came in and she was pale and I said, oh no. I said, you didn't get that call, did you? She said, you only have 3 days to live or whatever it was. I said, well, he's getting his fun just calling and telling me that because he thinks I'm scared to death. And I said, you know, he's just some nut. And so we got around that. Never happened, of course. Another one that called started giving me all this stuff. And one morning I'd had enough of that. And and I lit into him with some of the language I'd heard in construction working and in the Army. And he said, oh, and you're a preacher too. You know, it was okay for him to say it, but it wasn't okay for me. Fun part of that was that we had another meeting of the Council of Churches, to get the word right pretty soon. And here this kid shows up in his Nazi uniform. And I'm standing there with Father Schmidt, and I said, Father Schmidt, I said, it's all I can do to contain myself. I said, I want to walk over there and spit on that kid. Oh, Walter, he said, I got a better idea. He said, come on. I said, I know him. He said, he's Catholic. He said, I know him. I know his name. So we go over and we walk right up to him, and Father Schmidt said, aren't you so-and-so? And called him by name, and the kid, he wasn't talking. He was being a silent Nazi, just showing his uniform and all. And Father Schmidt said, I believe you've been calling me about 3 o'clock in the morning. The kid doesn't say anything. And I looked over and I said, yeah. I said, I'm Walter Stitt, and you've been calling me about 3 o'clock or 3:30 in the morning. The kid doesn't say a thing. So we turned around and walked away, and Schmidt laughed, and they never called us again after that. But, it was a fun time.
Now, you and Betty had a family.
Yes.
Tell us the name of your children.
We had 3 children. My first child was Robert, middle name Bailey. He still lives in Centerville.
How old's Bob?
Huh?
How old is Bob? About 70?
He is, he was born in 53. And then 2 years later, in 55, I had a son, William. And, well, we called him Billy, but his name was really William. And
he passed away when?
And he was hit by a truck when I was here in seminary. He was a first grader.
Oh, shoot.
And then my daughter was born in 58. And she lives here in town.
Her name?
Her name is Beverly Ann.
Married name?
Rutan, R-U-T-A-N.
What kind of career did Bob have, your son?
What kind of
career, what kind of work did he do?
Oh, well, he taught school for a while. Then he worked for Elder Bierman in their warehouse as a manager for a while. And then he went to work at, I'll get it right in a minute, America's Best Freight, ABF Freight. Although it's not America's Best Freight, I believe it's
Is that where he retired
Arkansas. And he retired from there about a year ago.
Beverly, did she work outside the home?
And Beverly was a school teacher. She graduated from Wittenberg, and she was her degree was in educable mentally retarded, which they later changed the name of it to special needs and different things like that. She ended up, she was asked to be a supervisor in that area in Champaign County, which she did for a year, and then came back and did that for quite a few years here in Clark County. She also was adjunct professor for a couple of years at Wittenberg in the teaching department. And she's been retired. She married a school teacher, Robert, and her husband Bob taught where you would have the kids in class in the morning, and then they worked all afternoon. And he did that for 35 years.
Well, you before our interview, you showed Tom and myself some of your medals down in your war room. What are some of the medals and commendations that you got for your service?
Well, I got the usual ones, for the fighting in Europe with 4 battle stars. I got the 2 Purple Hearts. And I couldn't tell you the names of the others right off.
Well, you got a good conduct medal, didn't you?
Yeah, I only got the medal.
But it wasn't on your discharge papers.
Wasn't on the discharge paper. The thing though it is with good conduct medal, you had to be in a certain place for a certain length of time, and then if you didn't have anything against you, why you got the good conduct medal. And
well, we've. When did you retire? I mean, you're 100 now. How old were you when you retired?
I retired at 68.
What have you done since retirement?
Well, I retired in 1968. When I was 68, I retired. I'm sorry, because I retired in what was it? I retired in 1992. And the next year, 93, I got a call from the bishop here in Ohio, and he wanted me to be the interim pastor of Saint John's Lutheran Church here in Springfield. And I did that for 14 months. Then I went back and I did another interim pastorate there in South Bend for another 8 months. And then I went to a church south of South Bend at Plymouth for about 3 or 4 months, and they changed bishops here in Ohio. And the new bishop called me. He was a longtime friend, and he asked me to be the pastor at First Lutheran here in town. And I tried to get out of that, but he said, well, just talk to him. So I went down and talked to him, and as a result, I ended up doing an interim with First Lutheran for about another 9 months. Then I went back to South Bend and was asked again to another church, Holy Trinity, if I would be the interim pastor there, and I did that again until they called another pastor, which took, I think, 7 or 8 months. And then that was the last of those, but I did an awful lot of supply preaching and things like that. And but the last time I preached church was here at First Lutheran, and it was at Zion Lutheran, and that's been about 2 years ago.
So you were what they call in baseball a real pinch hitter.
Oh yeah.
Tom, you've been very patient listening to what's been going on. You got any questions?
No.
Did you ever meet?
I have to admit to all this, and I've laughed about it. I said, well, the thing of it is that there's nobody living can say, oh, no, you didn't.
So you were over in Belgium and France. Did you ever meet General Patton?
No. No, Patton was with the 3rd Army, and I spent, the 3rd Armored Division was with 1st Army.
But you never had a chance to meet him.
So no.
All right.
The general of our division, who was killed, as we talked about earlier, I saw him from a distance, and that's the closest I ever got to him. When I was in basic training, we were out in the field, and the first sergeant came up to me and said, "Walter, get down to the kitchen truck and get a tray with a cup of coffee and some cream and sugar and bring it up here." And there was a general standing there and said, "And put it over there on that stump." I said, "Okay." And so I put it over there on the stump, and he said, "Now go over and tell the general you got a cup of coffee for him." Wow, here I am. I've only been in the Army a few months, and I'm a real recruit. So I go over and I snapped up a salute, and I said, "Sir, we have a cup of coffee for you over there on the stump." And the elderly general looked at me and said, "Man," he said, "I haven't had a salute like that in a long time." That's the closest I ever got to a general.
Well, it's been quite a long interview. Thank you for your time in this interview, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, Dan. I'm glad to do it.